It was a bleak autumn day in 1916. On the Western Front, the trenches sunk in the mud of the Somme River were silent, as if waiting for the end of the world. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and the whispers of death. Soldiers huddled together, rifles in their hands, exhaustion in their eyes, seeking a moment of peace in the cold mud. But in this trench, there was a voice unlike any other. A young soldier, his name was Pierre, softly humming a lullaby. Pierre was a 19-year-old French peasant boy. His blond hair was sticky with mud and sweat, and his blue eyes were pale, as if he had forgotten the sky. He was humming a lullaby his mother had sung to him as a child. "Let him sleep and grow up. Let the stars see him." The words softened the air for a moment, despite the gloom of the trench. Claude, a large man sitting next to him, turned to him and smiled. "You chose the wrong place to say that, my friend," he said sarcastically, but there was tenderness in his voice. Claude was 10 years older than Pierre and had been at the front since the beginning of the war. For him, Pierre was a kind of beacon of hope, an innocence that the war had not yet contaminated. That day, news began to circulate in the trenches. According to intelligence from the German lines, a raid was planned for the night. The officers were in a panic. The soldiers were just waiting for the next order. When Pierre finished his lullaby, he picked up his rifle and turned to Claude. "Do you think we will die tonight?" he asked, his voice shaky but full of curiosity. Claude hesitated for a moment, then put his hand on Pierre's shoulder. "Death is always near here, but you keep singing that lullaby. Maybe it will bring us luck." As night fell, the silence of the trench gave way to a hum. German cannons rumbled in the distance, each explosion shaking the earth and squeezing the hearts of the soldiers. Pierre continued to hum the lullaby on his lips while clutching his rifle tightly. Claude looked at him and thought, "This boy is like an angel, even in the middle of hell." But at that moment there was a whistling sound. A shell landed a few meters from the trench. The earth lifted up, mud splattered on the soldiers' faces. Pierre's lullaby was interrupted by a scream. After the explosion, Claude immediately returned to Pierre. The boy was fine, but he was shaking with fear. "Don't be afraid," Claude said. "The earth is protecting us." But at that moment, the voice of their officers rose. "Get ready! They are coming!" The shadows of German soldiers began to appear through the mist. Pierre aimed his rifle, but his hands were shaking. Claude shouted to encourage him. "Think of your lullaby, Pierre. It will save us." When the first bullets began to fly in the trench, Pierre's eyes closed for a moment. He saw his mother's face, the fields in the village, the ears of wheat swaying in the wind. And then he pulled the trigger of his rifle. It was the first time he had shot someone. There was a scream from across the street, but the fog obscured everything. Pierre's lullaby was now only an echo inside him. That night, the trench survived. The German raid had been repelled, but the casualties were heavy. In the early morning light, Pierre and Claude sat side by side, breathing. Pierre's lips moved, but no sound came out. Claude looked at him and asked softly, "Have you forgotten the lullaby?" Pierre shook his head. "No," he said. "I just realized that the earth didn't hear him." After that night's raid on the Somme, a silence had fallen over the trenches, but it was a silence of exhaustion rather than peace. The gray light of morning illuminated the mud and blood-soaked earth. Pierre and Claude sat side by side, trying to catch their breath. Around them were the moans of the wounded, the shouts of officers, and the heavy footsteps of soldiers carrying the dead. Pierre's hands were still shaking. The weight of shooting someone for the first time had fallen like a rock on his shoulders. Claude quietly lit his pipe and blew smoke into the air. "The first time is always hard," he said, gazing at the horizon, "but you get used to it." That afternoon, news reached the trenches. The mail had arrived. In the midst of war, letters were a treasure for soldiers. A few lines from home, from loved ones, the only thing that kept them alive in this hell. The postman walked along the trench in his muddy boots, shouting names and handing out envelopes. When Pierre's name was called, his eyes widened. He quickly got up, picked up the envelope, and retreated to a corner. Claude looked at him and smiled. "Did your mother write it?" he asked. Pierre nodded, his hands shaking again as he opened the envelope. The letter was from his mother, Marie. It described life in the village. "The harvest is poor this year, but we are still getting by." Your father is still stubborn in the fields, but he keeps asking for you. When are you coming back, Pierre? The lines were simple words written in ink, but Pierre's eyes filled with tears. He remembered the smell of his mother, the wood of the house, the wind in the fields. There was a sentence at the end of the letter that squeezed his heart. I pray for you every night, my son. Please come back safe and sound. Pierre pressed the envelope to his chest and murmured softly, I will come back, Mom. I promised Claude had received his own letter, but he didn't seem eager to open it. Pierre asked curiously, Who is yours from? Claude hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. From my wife, Elise, he said. But every letter is the same. Don't forget me. Come back, she says. It's like I'm here on vacation. There was a bitterness in his voice. Pierre noticed the shadows in Claude's eyes. The war had already scarred this man, but he was trying not to show it. That night there was silence in the trenches. Soldiers were reading their letters, some crying silently, others trying to memorize the lines. Pierre read his mother's letter over and over, hanging on to every word. But at that moment a whistle pierced the air. The German artillery had started again. A shell landed near the trench. The explosion threw the soldiers to the ground. The letter in Pierre's hand fell into the mud. In a panic, he bent down and picked it up. But the ink had mixed with the mud and some of the words were illegible. No! He screamed as if losing the letter was like losing his mother. Claude grabbed him by the arm and pulled him away. Hide! He shouted. The artillery rained down incessantly. Part of the trench collapsed. The screams of the soldiers filled the air. Pierre hid in a corner, pressing the letter to his chest. At that moment, a piece of shrapnel lodged in Claude's leg. The man groaned but gritted his teeth and fell to the ground. Pierre rushed towards him. Claude! Hold on! The blood was staining Claude's uniform red. Pierre looked around desperately, but the paramedics were far away. Claude smiled with difficulty. Protect your letter, Pierre, he said breathlessly. He will take you home. Pierre could not hold back his tears. You'll come too, he whispered. But Claude's eyes were slowly closing. Amid the noise of the cannons, Pierre began to hum his lullaby once more, this time for Claude. Let him sleep and grow up. But this lullaby was sung to a soil soaked with blood. By morning, the bombardment had stopped. Claude was alive but badly wounded. Pierre still clutched his letter tightly to his chest, stained with mud and blood. But those lines were hope for him. The soldiers in the trenches talked to each other about their letters as they dressed their wounds. But Pierre had only one question on his mind. Would this war take them home or bury them in the ground? The morning after the bombardment, the trench was deathly silent. The ground was covered in smoke, and the air smelled of gunpowder and blood. Pierre knelt beside Claude, watching his friend breathe in and out. The medics had finally arrived and removed the shrapnel from Claude's leg, but the wound was deep. Claude's face was chalky from the loss of blood, his eyes half closed, his lips dry and cracked. Pierre still held the blood-soaked letter to his chest. Hang on, Claude, he whispered, his voice shaky. We'll get you out of here. Beyond the trench, the officers gave a new order, counterattack. The German lines seemed weakened, and the commanders did not want to miss this opportunity. The men shouldered their rifles, even though they were exhausted. Pierre took one last look at Claude as he entrusted him to the medics. I'll be back, he said, but there was a shadow of farewell in Claude's eyes. Keep that letter, Pierre, he murmured with difficulty. It is your shield. When the order to attack came, a whistle rose from the trench. The soldiers burst out of the mud, screaming, Forward! Pierre held his rifle tightly, but his heart was pounding in his chest. The so-called nobody's land stretched out before them, littered with corpses and barbed wire. The fog blurred everything like a nightmare. As the first bullets began to fly, a soldier next to Pierre collapsed. He had been shot in the head. Blood mixed with the mud. Pierre hesitated for a moment, but then Claude's words came back to him. He is your shield. He pressed the letter to his chest and kept running. As they approached the German trenches, the sound of machine guns was deafening. Pierre jumped into a ditch and clung to the ground, gasping for breath. Around him, his friends fell one by one, some screaming, some silently. At that moment, a shadow fell over him. When he looked up, a young German soldier stood before him. The boy was not so different from Pierre. The same fearful eyes, the same trembling hands. They both aimed their rifles, but for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Pierre's lips moved. His lullaby rose like a whisper. Let him sleep and grow up. The German soldier pulled the trigger, but Pierre fired at the same time. The bullets seemed to collide in the air. The German boy was hit in the chest and collapsed, while Pierre was hit in the shoulder by a piece of shrapnel. He groaned in pain, but he was alive. Lying in the ditch, he looked up at the sky. He seemed to see his mother's face in the gray clouds. He put his hand to his chest. The letter was still there, but now covered in blood. The attack was successful after hours of chaos. The German trench had been captured, but at a heavy cost. Pierre was carried back to the French lines, wounded. In the medical tent, while his shoulder was being dressed, his eyes searched for Claude. When he finally found him, his friend's face had a little more color. "Did we make it?" Claude asked in a weak voice. Pierre shook his head. "But we lost a lot." That night, amid the moans of wounded soldiers in the tent, a lament rose. A soldier played a sad melody on his guitar. There were no words, but every note seemed to be written in lead. Pierre sat down next to Claude and took out his letter. The blood and mud had almost completely erased her mother's writing, but a few words were still legible. "I pray for you." Pierre could not hold back his tears. "This letter saved me," he told Claude. "But why is it so heavy?" Claude looked at him and gently held out his hand. "Because it was written in blood, Pierre. All of our blood." At that moment, news came from outside the tent. There was new activity at the front. The war was not yet over. Pierre pressed the letter to his chest and made a promise. "I'll come home, Mom, but first I will end this hell." The day after the German trench was captured, it was cold and damp. The wounded groaned in the medical tent, while the surviving soldiers were exhausted. Pierre's shoulder wound had been dressed, but every movement caused him pain. Claude lay in bed, trying to keep his eyes open despite the pain in his leg. Inside the tent, the smell of gunpowder and tincture of tincture mixed together. Outside, officers were discussing maps and whispers of a new plan were spreading among the soldiers. Pierre sat next to Claude, turning his blood-soaked letter over in his hand. "When do you think this war will end?" he asked, his voice desperate. Claude sat up with difficulty and looked at him. "Wars don't end, Pierre. It just sleeps for a while. But we swore to go home, didn't we?" Pierre nodded. He remembered the promise he had made to his mother when he left the village at the beginning of the war. "I will return." Claude had made a similar vow to his wife, but now those vows seemed forgotten. The blood and mud had overshadowed everything else. That afternoon, an officer entered the tent. His face was stern, his voice firm. "All those who can stand, get ready. There is a new order." A murmur went up among the soldiers. "We've just taken a trench. What do they want?" someone muttered. The officer spread the map on the table and pointed to a spot with his finger. "The Germans have not retreated. They are preparing a bigger line. If we don't hit them now, we'll never get another chance." Pierre looked at Claude. "But what about the wounded?" he asked. The officer replied coldly, "War does not wait." Pierre stood up, suppressing the pain in his shoulder. Claude tried to get out of bed too, but his leg would not support him. "You can't go without me," he said stubbornly. Pierre turned to him and smiled. "You fought enough for me." Rest, but there was desperation in Claude's eyes. "Remember our vow, Pierre?" he whispered. "We will return together." Before leaving the trench, Pierre murmured a prayer in the corner of the tent. His lullaby was no longer on his lips. It had been replaced by a promise to his mother. He shouldered his rifle and marched with the other soldiers towards nobody's land. This time the target was a hill where the Germans had just fortified. As usual, the fog was thick and the shadows danced like ghosts. As the attack began, the sound of machine guns pierced the air once more. Pierre jumped into a ditch and held his breath. One of the soldiers next to him was shot in the first minute. His blood splattered Pierre's face. At that moment, he heard a scream. It was not the cry of a man, but of an oath, as if the war was swallowing all promises. Pierre raised his rifle and fired. Every bullet was an obstacle on the way home, but something inside reminded him of his oath. "I will return." After hours of fighting, the hill was captured, but victory was again written in blood. Pierre returned with the survivors, his shoulder wound reopened and his uniform soaked in blood. When he reached the trenches, he found Claude in the medical tent. His friend seemed happy to see him, but there was a shadow on his face. "Did you make it?" he asked. Pierre shook his head. "But the price is too high." That night, there was silence in the tent. The soldiers were remembering their fallen comrades and licking their wounds. Pierre sat next to Claude and asked softly, "Do you think our oaths are still valid?" Claude thought for a moment, then answered, "Even if they are not, we have to remember them. It makes us human." Pierre took out his blood-soaked letter and read it once more. The words had been erased, but his mother's voice was still in his ears. Just then, news came from outside the tent. The Germans were preparing a massive counterattack. Pierre and Claude looked at each other. Their vow rose like a cry in the shadow of war, forgotten, but still alive. The night after the capture of the hill, there was a restlessness in the trenches. The soldiers knew the Germans were preparing a counterattack. There was a tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. Pierre sat next to Claude in the medical tent. The wound in his shoulder still stung, but he didn't care. Claude's leg was a little better. The medics said they could send him back to the front in a few days, but there was a reluctance in Claude's eyes. "Are you going to fight without me?" he asked, a bitterness in his voice. Pierre smiled. "I'll fight for you, too." As dawn broke, the moment came. A cannon sounded in the distance, and then the sky was filled with the whistle of German shells. The trenches shook. The mud lifted. Pierre immediately grabbed his rifle and turned to Claude. "Hide!" he shouted, but Claude gave him a weak wave. "Go, Pierre. I'm fine." When he came out of the tent, the smoke was all around him. He could hardly see. Soldiers were running to their positions in panic, officers shouting orders. The counterattack was more fierce than expected. The Germans were doing everything in their power to retake the hill they had lost. Machine guns rained bullets over the trench, bullets riddling the earth. Pierre cowered in a ditch and held his breath. The smoke burned his lungs, his eyes watered. But it wasn't just the smoke. A soldier was lying next to him, shot in the chest, breathing his last. Pierre reached out to help him, but it was too late. The boy's eyes were staring at an empty sky. At that moment, an explosion echoed near the trench. The earth rained down on Pierre. His ears were buzzing. In the smoke, he thought he heard his mother's voice. "You will return, my son." He held the letter tightly to his chest and said a prayer. But the prayer turned into a scream, because through the smoke, the shadows of German soldiers appeared. Pierre aimed his rifle and fired. Each bullet hit a tear. The hours of fighting were like a nightmare. Smoke permeated every corner of the trench, painting the faces of the soldiers gray. Pierre held out with the survivors, but their strength was running out. At that moment, an officer shouted, "Fall back!" Back to the tents. Pierre jumped out of the pit and started running. The smoke seemed to engulf him. He didn't even know where he was going. But something told him he had to find Claude. When he reached the medical tent, chaos reigned. The wounded were being carried inside. The medics were running desperately. Pierre ran to Claude's bed, but it was empty. He looked around in panic. "Claude!" he shouted. A medic turned to him and nodded. He was taken behind the front line. Before the attack, Pierre's heart clenched. Claude was gone, but he was alive. He didn't know if that was a consolation or a loss. As the smoke slowly cleared, the state of the trench became clear. The Germans had retaken the hill. The French had suffered a heavy defeat. Pierre crouched in a corner of the tent and took out his letter. Blood and mud had completely erased his mother's words. Only a piece of paper remained. Tears released the emotions that the smoke had hidden. "Why, Mom?" she whispered. "Why is it so hard?" That night, the surviving soldiers hugged each other, crying silently. The smoke hid the tears, but it couldn't hide the pain. Pierre remembered Claude's vow. "We will return together." But now he was alone. He picked up his rifle and made another promise. "I will find you, Claude, and I will take you home." On the morning of defeat, those who remained in the trenches were like an army of ghosts. The smoke had cleared, leaving only destruction and silence. Pierre sat in the corner of the medical tent, staring blankly at the horizon. The wound in his shoulder had stopped bleeding, but the wound inside was deeper. Ever since he had learned that Claude had been taken to the front line, he had been confused. The fact that his friend was alive was a ray of hope, but he couldn't help feeling as if he had lost him. The letter in her hand was now just a piece of paper. Her mother's words had been erased, but the weight of them was still in her chest. That day, an officer came to the tent and addressed the soldiers. We are leaving the trenches. We are retreating. A murmur went up among the soldiers, some relieved, others angry. Pierre picked up his rifle and threw his rucksack over his shoulder. The retreat was a defeat, but it was also a chance to reach Claude. The officer showed the map and pointed to a town behind the front line. The wounded have been moved there. We will gather there. Pierre's eyes lit up. Claude is there, he thought. The journey began in mud and rain. The soldiers walked like shadows in their broken uniforms. Some were wounded, some could barely carry their rifles. Pierre moved silently in the middle of the group, thinking of Claude with every step. His vows haunted him. We will return together. But the war had shattered that oath. Still, he would not give up. When they arrived in the town, the scene was heartbreaking. The streets were full of wounded soldiers. An old church had been turned into a makeshift hospital. Pierre immediately went in search of Claude. Inside the church, beds were lined up in rows and moans filled the air. He approached a paramedic and asked, "Have you seen Claude Moreau?" His leg was injured. The paramedic looked at a list and nodded. "He's on the second floor, but he's not well." Pierre took the stairs two at a time. When he found Claude, his friend's face was pale beyond recognition. His leg was bandaged, but the infection had started. Claude smiled weakly when he saw Pierre. "There you are," he said, his voice weak. Pierre crouched down beside the bed. "Would I ever leave you?" Claude's hand reached for Pierre's arm. "Take me home, Pierre. We promised." At that moment, a doctor came to them and gave Pierre the bad news. "We may have to amputate his leg. The infection has gone too far." Claude's eyes widened, but he remained silent. Pierre held his friend's hand tightly. "It's enough that you're alive," he said, his eyes filling up. "I'll be back even if I don't have a leg," Claude murmured, but there was a break in his voice. The operation was performed that night. Pierre waited outside the church, the rain soaking his face, but he didn't even realize it. Claude's uniform lay folded beside the bed, broken, torn, but still part of him. Pierre thought as he looked at it, "This war took everything from us, but this is not our legacy. We will go home." In the morning, Claude woke up. His leg was gone, but he was alive. Pierre looked at him and smiled. "Are you ready?" he asked. Claude gave a weak laugh. "I left my leg here, but not my vow." The two of them embraced each other. The broken uniforms had become their legacy. The war had shattered their bodies, but not yet their souls. Before leaving town, Pierre looked once more at the blank paper of the letter. His mother's erased words were now written on his heart. "We'll go home," he whispered. But the last breath of war was still waiting for them. A week passed in the town after the night Claude's leg was amputated. The rain had stopped and the sky was covered in a gray blanket. In the church hospital, the wounded were slowly recovering. Others were quietly passing away. Pierre stood vigil at Claude's bedside, watching his friend's every breath, trying to give him strength. Claude seemed not yet to have come to terms with the loss of his leg, but there was determination in his eyes. "We'll go home, Pierre," he said often, his voice weak but stubborn. That morning, news reached the town. The armistice talks had begun. The end of the war was near. A wave of joy spread among the soldiers, some crying, others praying. Pierre turned to Claude and smiled. "Do you hear me? It's almost over." Claude shook his head. "But we are not finished. We will keep our promise." A few days later, the official news came. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, an armistice had been signed. The guns in the trenches fell silent. The cannonade gave way to a deep silence. Soldiers from the town gathered in front of the church. With their broken uniforms and wounded bodies, they embraced each other. Pierre carried Claude out on a stretcher, the cold air licking both their faces. It was as if the silence had kissed peace, but this peace was at the end of a very long road. Pierre looked at Claude and asked, "What do you feel?" Claude looked up at the sky for a moment, then answered, "Lightness, but incomplete." He had lost his leg. The war had changed him, but he was alive. Pierre held his friend's hand tightly. "We are not lacking. We are together." At that moment, he took out the blank sheet of paper from his mother's letter and handed it to Claude. "This took us home," he said. Claude smiled. "No, Pierre, you did." When it was time to leave the town, Pierre and Claude were put on a train with the other wounded. As the train traveled deeper into France, fields, villages, and the first signs of peace were visible through the windows. Pierre sat next to Claude, silently looking out. He imagined his mother's face, his house in the village. Claude closed his eyes and thought of his wife Elise. "Do you think he still loves me?" he asked softly. Pierre turned to him and laughed. "Who wouldn't love a stubborn man like you?" When the train reached their village, a crowd was waiting for them at the station. Pierre saw his mother. Marie ran to hug her son as soon as she recognized him. Her tears were tears of years of pain. "You're back, my son," she whispered. Pierre cried in his mother's arms. The erased words of the letter now came to life in her voice. Claude was greeted by Elise. She didn't even look at his missing leg. She hugged him tightly and said, "You haven't forgotten me." Claude replied, looking into his wife's eyes, "Never." That night there was silence in the village. The war was over, but traces of it remained. Pierre and Claude sat in the village square, looking at the stars. Their broken uniforms had been laid aside. Their vows had been fulfilled. Pierre began softly humming his lullaby. "Let him sleep and grow up. Let the stars see him." Claude joined him. Their voices mingled in the peace kissed by silence. The story ended here. Pierre and Claude had been through hell, but they had not lost each other and their vows. The earth had heard the laments written in blood. The smoke had hidden their tears, but peace had finally embraced them. They had come home.